Now moving back here into the GPMC, we have our fourth and final topic here in these four use cases for group policy settings, and that has to do with Group Policy Software Installation, or GPSI. GPSI is a mechanism to allow you to deploy software to different computers around your network. Now, one of the limitations, however, with GPSI is that in order for it to function, the software that you deploy, the actual code, the installer file, needs to be constructed in such a way that it is silent, meaning that there are no dialog boxes that pop up requesting further information for the install to complete. GPSI also has a limitation in that it can only deploy MSI files. If you have a .exe file, the only way to get that .exe file deployed is through the use, a very advanced topic, but through the use of what's called a ZAP file. And further, when you have a .exe that you need to install, well, those exes install under the security context of the user being logged in. And so typically you don't have users, there are admins on their machines, so it makes it very difficult to install software. Recognizing those limitations, however, there are a couple of really good use cases where GPSI can come in handy for installing special pieces of software that are kind of designed to be deployed using group policy. Now, one such piece of software is, for many organizations, the actual Config Manager client. Now, this is not intended to be a discussion on Configuration Manager. We just want to talk about GPSI and how it can deploy out a piece of software. But in fact, here you'll notice that I've actually downloaded and exploded the Config Manager DVD. This is Config Manager 2012 R2, because I want to show you that this is one really excellent example of how you can use GPSI to relatively easily deploy out a piece of software onto machines. It also is handy if you need to bootstrap your whole organization into that Config Manager infrastructure. Now, I do this because down here under SMS Setup, and then in the bin i386 folder down here, if I take a look down here at the bottom, there is a file here called ccmsetup.msi. This is the installer file, the MSI file that's used in a Config Manager environment for deploying out the agents to different machines around your network. And the first step in this process is actually to copy out this MSI file and host it in some location that has the appropriate permissions and share level permissions such that all the clients on the network can access the file. So let's start this process actually by copying this MSI file and then dropping it to some location here on our domain controller, DC. Here under the E drive, let me just create another folder here. Let's call this CCM Setup. And then for this folder, let's give it the appropriate permissions that it requires. So here under sharing, let's go ahead and share the folder as CCM Setup. Let's add permissions so that everyone has read access to its contents. Let's also ensure over here that under the security view, that the everyone group also has read access to the file, so everyone. This will give any incoming client the necessary privileges to be able to read this file and then copy it to the local location and install the CCM Setup Configuration Manager agent. With this configured now, let's go ahead and paste in that file, that ccmsetup.msi file. We can now, from every client on our network, access this MSI file. And so in this location, we should now be able to create a group policy, the group policy setting, that allows us to then deploy out the Config Manager agent. Let's go ahead and create that new group policy object here. And we'll call this install sccm 2012 R2 agent. Once we've created it here, we'll go ahead and edit this, and then here under Computer Configuration and Policies, and then Software Settings is one of the locations where we can actually go about configuring this software installation. Now, when we do that, one of the first things you'll have to identify is where you stored the file. So if I right-click here and choose New Package, it's here where we need to identify where this file exists. And it's very important here that you reference this file using UNC paths as opposed to the drive letter where it exists. So DC /CCM setup /CCM setup.msi. Now for this next step in the process, you actually have three different approaches you can use for deploying out this piece of software. Those are assigning the software versus publishing the software, and then assigning it versus publishing it to either users or computers. In fact, let me bring up a little diagram here that makes things a little easier to understand, because each one of these has different meaning in terms of how the user will interact with this software installation. For the first, we have assigning the application to a user. Now, when you assign the application to a user, that application will install after the user signs on. So when the user logs onto the machine, they receive that group policy. That group policy will then install this piece of software as that user logs in. This is different from assigning the app to the computer, which is what we're about to do here. When you assign an application to a computer, the application installs when the computer powers on. So as that machine ends up powering on, it's then and only then when the software will get installed. In most situations, you find organizations actually assigning apps to computers because that provides the best security context for that application to be installed. Obviously, with the computer just powering on, there is no user logged in, so the application can get installed with the appropriate administrative rights. Now, this is very different from the alternative, which is publishing the application to the user. And this is an approach that honestly is not used in very many organizations, if at all, these days. Now, have you ever poked through the control panel and found a little control panel icon there called Add and Remove Programs? You might have found Add and Remove Programs in very old versions of the operating system, like Windows XP. Well, think back a minute about the Add and Remove Programs link. When you were using that, what did you use that link for? Typically, you go to Add and Remove Programs to actually get rid of a piece of software on a computer. But that's only the remove part of Add and Remove Programs. Most people don't recognize that the add part of Add and Remove Programs is designed to link up with a published application that has been delivered through group policy software installation. And so if you choose to publish an app to a user, that application will not install unless the user goes to Add Remove Programs, or whatever the new version of that icon is in the control panel, and specifically selects to install that application. As I said, most organizations do not use this mechanism anymore. In fact, Add Remove Programs, I think, has been renamed in the control panel these days. But this third option here provides a way for you to make the app available to the user, and they only install it when they've determined that they require the application. Now, the fourth little box here is one that would be to publish the app to the computer. This actually doesn't exist. There actually is not a way for you to publish an app to a computer. And so for that reason, if we come back down here, you'll notice that the published method right here is grayed out because we're focused here on computer configuration. In our use case here, what we're looking to do is actually deploy this piece of software out and require it to be installed the next time the computer logs in. So we're going to publish this GPSI package to computer configuration, and we'll set it up as assigned. Now, when I do that, I'm actually going to click the Advanced button here so you can see a couple more additional screens. But if I hit the OK button, this will actually go about creating all the metadata that surrounds that package that we copied up to the file share just a second ago. Here's the name of the package, Config Manager Client Setup Bootstrap. I can provide a URL down here if a person needs to access support information. Here under deployment, I can choose which deployment type, which in our case is only for assigned. Under deployment options, I can also choose to uninstall the application should it fall out of the scope of management. Now, this is a very challenging checkbox here, particularly when you have these core applications that need to be on machines. If this computer falls out of the scope of management, if it's no longer a member of the OU where this GPO is applied, it is entirely possible that by selecting this box, you could inadvertently have that application uninstalled from the computer. For this reason, in most situations, you don't find people checking this box because you could end up with a lot of computers that are in an unknown state as far as the installation of the app. Down here under Advanced is where we can choose to ignore the language, so essentially deploy any language to any desktop, where we can include any OLE classes and product information. The big one here is whether or not you want to make this 32-bit application available to 64-bit machines. In most situations, yes, that is going to be the case. Now back here under Upgrades is where later on, after we deploy this package, you could then add in a subsequent package that would upgrade the existing installation. A lot of times you'll find that when you've got a, for example, Config Manager client of a newer version, that you need to update the existing Config Manager clients. You could configure categories as well for pieces of software. Most of the time you don't see these populated because most organizations don't have large quantities of software that they need to deploy, so much so that they need to create categories. Here under Modifications is where you could apply a transform, an MST file to an existing MSI. Now, in circumstances where you have an MSI that requires someone to enter in information as the software is installed, you could potentially create an MST file to supply those answers as part of the install. That is a very advanced topic for another day, but indeed this is the location where you would add in those MST files that you would want to copy into that same file share location we took a look at just a second ago. And then lastly here is security, where you can define which users and or computers should actually deploy the piece of software. As we talked about back in that last module, this is a location where you could then tailor down where this piece of software should get deployed if you should deploy this GPO to an organizational unit with more machines than those you want to deploy the software to. So this is really kind of all the different configurations here for GPSI. You'll notice that once we do that, right here, the Config Manager Client Setup Bootstrap in version 5 is now available for deployment to any machine that receives this GPO. Now, important caveat here is that when configuring any kind of group policy software installation where we're assigning it through computer configuration, remember that the only time those machines are going to get this software is when they reboot. So you may have to actually go through and force a reboot for all the machines where you want this software to get deployed.